As physicians, everything we do starts with trust. But what happens when that trust is broken or never forms in the first place? Being a doctor doesn't carry the same implicit authority that it once did. In a world filled with social media experts, Dr. Google, and keyboard cowboys, our patients are pulled in more directions than taffy at a county fair. What do we do when simply telling the patient what we think they should do isn't good enough? How do we help them navigate really important decisions with so many competing influences? When it comes to things like Tylenol and pregnancy, vaccination options, or even whether to get thrombolytics when having a stroke, a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't cut it. It's time for a shift change. My name is Mike McDonald.
And I'm Gina Blocker.
We are emergency physicians with over 35 years of combined experience in community, military, and academic settings. We have courtroom experience.
Both good and bad.
We have business experience.
Both as owners and employees.
We are each married with 5 kids.
But not to each other.
Odds are good that if you're an emergency physician, you will experience burnout, job dissatisfaction, assault in the workplace, depression, anxiety, litigation, and more. We've chosen a career that can literally take years off our lives. So this podcast is here to bring you the doom and gloom and to encourage you to quit.
Wait a second. No. We are 2 emergency physicians who have survived all of the above and are still standing. This podcast is to help you prolong your career in spite of the odds. We will tell you the things we wish we had known when we were starting our careers, use an evidence-based approach to the problems facing our specialty, and offer solutions that have helped us and others using the lessons we've learned along the way.
Okay, that sounds better. Okay, welcome once again to the Shift Change Podcast. I am Mike McDonald, and you will notice today I am not joined by my co-host, Gina Blocker. She, I would love to tell you, is out on vacation, but she's actually working a shift today, unfortunately. So she doesn't even have a fun excuse not to be here. But I'm excited to welcome Dr. Alana Newell to the show. She has agreed to join me for this episode where we're going to talk about, I term it cigarettes and bad decisions. A friend of mine coined that phrase when we were walking through a casino one time, and it's stuck with me ever since as sort of the concept of just living that life. You walk through any casino anywhere, and it just encapsulates the whole thing: cigarettes and bad decisions. Okay, Dr. Newell, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you ended up on the show today?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
I was going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, just the whole backstory. So yeah, I'm an education PhD. I have been in education specifically at Baylor College of Medicine for my entire career. I would note though that I am not today speaking as a representative of my institution, but solely as an individual. So it's a little bit interesting because I got into education as actually a summer job. When I was in college, I started working here and just helping with educational outreach. And when I graduated, I came on full-time, was a project coordinator, and then realized I really like this. So I worked full-time through my master's, my PhD, and I am now, I'm still at the Center for Educational Outreach, but I've branched also into doing work with faculty, helping them really think about how to best educate others. And so I do a lot of the work in evaluation, I do a lot of work with thinking about the best ways to educate and what it means to be scholarly in teaching and learning. And I ended up here today because you and I had a side conversation about what it looks like to identify as a scientist and how that shifts as people move into practice and what the repercussions for that might be for people who then have to talk to patients about the direction that they go forward. So
absolutely. Yeah. So I am fascinated by your job because you teach the teachers at the highest level, and you also interact with kindergarten students, 10-year-olds. I think that speaks to your, it has to say something about you, because most people, even teachers, dedicate, I know friends that are a kindergarten teacher, and she's been a kindergarten teacher her whole life. And that's the only age that she does, right? I think the ability to teach can span different levels in a really interesting way. And I think the way that you tie all that together is fascinating. So you and I met as part of you lead one of the classes that I'm in. And after one of those classes, we were talking about thinking scientifically. And I don't even remember kind of how it started, but I remember making the comment that, I'm a doctor, I think like a scientist. And you kind of pushed back on that. And we're like, well, not all doctors think of themselves that way. And like that concept had never even occurred to me before. And so that led into this sort of broader conversation that led us down this little rabbit hole that we're talking about today. So where we want to go with this is by way of background. There's obviously in our current cultural context, there's a lot of debate surrounding scientific recommendations, specifically as it relates to public health. So things like immunizations, coming out of COVID, that was obviously a hot topic. But then now even more broadly with our current political situation, the question of whether vaccines are good is kind of front and center in a lot of people's minds. Tylenol in pregnancy is a recent thing that has come into the public mind. And a lot of these things they've made people question whether sort of the scientific community as a whole is making good recommendations or whether there's some other motivation behind the things that we say. And so where this, I think, really started, this cultural shift started during COVID. And while I work in the Houston area, I work in the Texas Med Center, I live in a more rural setting. And so my experience during COVID of people's response to like mask recommendations, social distancing, all those kinds of things, may be a little different than what you experienced in Houston. So share with us a little bit just your perspective on kind of how that time frame went in your world.
So it's a little bit fascinating because I have this very kind of interesting overlap between education space and health profession space. So of course, both sets of individuals, people who are in education, whatever the level, and people who are in the health professions actively working clinically, were both essential personnel during COVID. So you got a lot of people who and you probably went through some of this too, like March, April, May, everyone's a hero. And people are like doing parades down the street, holding signs, thank you for all you do. And then the tide kind of starts turning in both respects for both groups of people moving through. And with one of the activities I do, we were really, as schools were opening up in late kind of fall 2020, and there was a little bit more negativity and a little bit more skepticism. We were putting together a unit for elementary and secondary students on COVID. And one of the things that we were looking at was, hey, we do a lot of public health information, but it's just very rules based, right? It's like stand 6 feet apart to be safe. And we don't really talk about the science behind it. So we're like, hey, let's think scientifically with this. Let's get the kids engaged. We'll do some activities where they have spray bottles and how far do droplets go. And we'll talk about these things. And it was very interesting. By the time it got into classrooms, it was spring 2021. We had seen this whole big pivot from your heroes, we trust our scientists, we are into this, to a lot of skepticism. And the little kids that we did these activities with were like, oh, I understand why I stand this far apart. The older kids there's a lot of skepticism already. So we're like, something has happened here in this space. And all the clinicians that I worked with similarly went from feeling like, oh, I get all this, to some of them being like, I have questions about the scientific standards, or my patients aren't listening to me. So it was a time between teachers and health professionals, everyone in that space who had been heroes just a year before. By the time you hit May 2021, they were wondering about the science themselves. They didn't know how to talk about it with others. And everyone was kind of feeling like, well, credibility wise, where are we and how do we talk about these things?
Yes. And I think that really highlights what we want to talk about today is, we'll probably get into the trust issues at another time. But I think as I was thinking through preparing for this, it really got me thinking about that concept of trust and who has the authority because that really is what people are looking for. Like, who are you to tell me what to do is ultimately the question. Now, in full disclosure, spoiler alert, we're not here to tell you what to do, and we're not going to tell you, you should get vaccinated, you should do this, because what I think a big part of kind of the other part of this issue is that a lot of times recommendations are painted in that this is what you should do, period, hard stop, or this is what you should not do, period, hard stop. And regardless of the recommendation, when it's presented that way, I mean, I'm a contrarian by nature. Who are you to tell me what to do? I don't want to listen. So we're going to talk about a framework for thinking through decisions a little more scientifically and getting into that, like, well, why is that? And is that the right thing for me? And so I wanted to start with an example for any of you parents of young kids out there. I'm going to give you an example. If your child was to get sick and you take them to the doctor, and your doctor tells you they have an extremely common illness. We see this all the time. This is not a big deal. Most of the time, almost always, this resolves without treatment. Symptoms usually resolve within 72 hours. So if you can just sort of gut through it, this is something that's likely to go away. But there is a medicine that we can use for it. That medicine has some risks associated with it. There are some adverse reactions. Those things include anaphylaxis and allergic reactions. It can give your child a rash, anything from a fungal, like yeast infection, all the way to these like skin peeling things, something called exanthematous pustulosis. I don't know what it is, but it sounds really bad. It can cause drug-induced enterocolitis. It can suppress any or all of your bone marrow cell lines. It can cause jaundice, seizures, vomiting, and something called black hairy tongue. Now, half of the time, this disease is caused by something that this drug won't even treat. Do you want to give this drug to your child? When you paint it that way, I'm obviously embellishing a little bit, because the answer is obviously no. Like, this sounds like a horrible thing for something that doesn't really matter, right? And what I'm talking about is giving amoxicillin to a child with an ear infection, right? That's something I've been cursed out repeatedly for not doing for parents when I tell them, hey, your kid doesn't need antibiotics for this. This is likely to go away. I've been screamed at and berated. I've been insulted 6 ways from Sunday for not doing this. But I think it's an interesting example that sort of highlights this concept of how do we think through decisions? And to your point earlier, Elena, do doctors think like scientists? Your dad was a physician, right? Your dad's
Yes.
was a retired emergency physician?
Yes. And my mom's a retired pediatrician. So I grew up with folks on both sides kind of talking through these things. And what I find really...
Picked the perfect analogy.
yes. So what's really fascinating is of this thinking like a scientist is that something on our K-12 level with our little kids, we really try to do. There are a multitude of studies that talk about the relationship between science identity, like thinking of yourself as a science person and your likelihood of going on and entering the health professions, whatever field you go into. But it's one of those things that there's strong associations between that process, right? Like, I am a science person. I think about things critically. I want to think about things like a scientist. I want to, take evidence and weigh risks. Those sorts of things that you think about as scientific thinking are the things that, you would think would get you into the field. But what's interesting is that there have been some folks who have started looking at like professional identity formation in like medical students. And I don't know if many have gone into the realm of physician education as well, but are we still, when kids are entering and looking at, students are looking at basic sciences and they're applying them in medicine, are we still focusing on thinking about science in the same way? Or is it just kind of, this is a thing that's in service of what you're going to do clinically? So move ahead. It's just kind of, I don't know if there's a disconnect there for everyone or how that interacts, but it is a fascinating kind of formation or developmental.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because to your point, I've just always sort of thought of myself that way, even when I was younger and in high school and whatever. Uh, and I guess some people, you kind of think of people in broad categories. Like I have an artsy child, and I have a scientific child, and I have like a hands-on kind of builder child. Like I've got 5 kids, and so they all kind of they demonstrate different personality traits. But obviously, those are really big boxes to put people in. But some of that has to do with sort of self-identity and the way that you perceive yourself to be, like more logical versus more feeling. And we could go to down the rabbit hole of like personality questionnaires and what's your personality type. I'm the personality type that doesn't like to be told what personality type I am, so I don't like this test. Wherever that puts me on the spectrum, that's where I land. But when we talk about thinking like a scientist, talk a little bit about what that means. Like what is the distinctive there?
Yeah. So when we're talking about thinking like a scientist, we're talking about like weighing evidence, right? And asking questions and really taking this, everyone's like, oh, the kids need critical thinking, but it really is kind of a systematic critical thinking frame that we're asking people to use. And so when we've got kids in science fair all the way up to when we have medical students in labs, we are asking them to ask questions, to take systematic approaches, to weigh the evidence, and then discuss their recommendations based on what the evidence suggests. One of the things that this summer I was working with a group of teachers talking about the difference between science writing in textbooks for like elementary, secondary kids and science writing that scientists do. And we had this whole conversation about hedging language and how, when we talked about COVID earlier, it was like you stand 6 feet apart from someone because you should just do it. This is a rule. We're doing it this way. This is how this works. And then when you get into literature that's looking at the scientists who are publishing on this, they're saying things like, well, our data suggests that there's a 95% probability that within this, and so there's all this hedging language that's used and you make decisions based on it. And when this information gets like funneled down through like science writers who are trying to put stuff in the newspaper and do things that are a little bit more casual, it goes from, well, our data strongly suggests in our sample that it is, 95% probability that these mice will result in like slightly smaller, statistically significantly smaller cancer cells, to they say bacon cures cancer, and it gets to this sort of like very firm.
That's definitely a more catchy headline.
Right. And faster to say. So yeah, it's just a different kind of, when we're thinking like scientists, there is this degree of ambiguity, nuance, and weighing of evidence, and constantly updating what we're thinking about.
Sure, and I'd be amiss if I didn't mention this is not the way that you should make all decisions. Right? Like, all decisions ought not be based on the scientific method. Like that's not how I ended up marrying my wife. Like, consider the pros and cons and weigh the evidence of like how likely is this to succeed. There's a
randomized controlled trial
interval. Like that's not how I landed on this. But I think it does speak to, like, that's kind of a funny example of not all decisions that we make are made just based on fact. And I think just recognizing that is an important step in realizing which decisions do need to be made that way. And so in the intro, we talked about thrombolytics for a stroke. That's a really big decision that has to be made very quickly, often with limited information, and there's huge risk associated with it. There's risk of not doing it, and there's risk of doing it. And I think that's a good example for the way that I teach the residents to think in their decision making when it comes to what do I recommend to my patient. Because I tell them to put it in separate categories where there's risk of action and there's benefit of action, and there's risk of inaction and benefit of inaction. And sometimes there's overlap between those boxes, but usually if you frame things into those categories, the decision you're trying to make becomes much more obvious. And so, when you're weighing something the point that I always try to convey is that there's risk in every one of those boxes. So when we're talking about, for example, immunizations, right? All of the, not all of the risk is on one side of the equation. It's not a zero-sum game where it's 100%. Everyone should always get vaccinated all the time. But I think that's why it becomes such a controversial topic, because that's how it's presented to people. Well, scientists say that you should do this, period, end of story. Don't even question why. There's a lot more nuance to it. And I think hedging is important. So my wife teaches English as a second language, and she has me come in to some of her classes as like question the doctor day. And they put me on the spot and asked about this, and I presented it to them in the same way, where I was like, listen, immunization is important in public health because from a population standpoint, you want to limit the spread of disease generally. Like that, I think most people would agree is a good idea, to try to limit how many people across the population, across the world, get a disease. Does that mean that you personally should get vaccinated? Well, not necessarily. Like, you got to take more things into consideration than that. And I think, I imagine that your work with kids, and as you know, they go from younger to older, they start asking those questions in a more nuanced way. And I would imagine that that's probably part of why you have that different response, where the younger kids, okay, you told me to do it, so I'm going to do it. And the older kids are like, you're not the boss of me.
Well, so what was interesting though, it wasn't even that the younger kids were like, oh, you told me to do it, I'm going to do it, because our whole take was like, let's teach them the science and why the conclusions got there. So we had them spray bottle with droplets. How far did it go? It was about this far. So can you understand where we came up with this from? And the younger kids were like, oh yeah, they say 6 feet because on average, my droplets went, between 4.5 to 7 feet and 6 feet, like, whatever, kind of conclusions they came to, recognizing that there was some variance there. The older kids, they were doing, of course, different activities. It wasn't the same, but there were questions about whether or not things were actually like, which in some ways actually is good. It's like, did we have an agenda, or, what, I still am not sure about this or that. And I think there is a need to question things. Like, it's something that we work with middle school students on, scientific decision making, like how decisions are made, in just what you're talking about. Like, for you personally, is this something that needs to happen? And they get cases and they look at the cases and they try to determine, for this individual in this case study, what would you recommend based on what you know about their background? And that's exactly, honestly, physicians do. That's learning differential diagnosis, right? Like this is what everyone is doing. Like, in this particular situation, how do I decide what this is? And then how do I decide what the treatment should be for it? So starting them at a very young age, looking at things like that. But on the other hand, being able to then look at evidence and say, am I weighting this evidence appropriately for the source that it came from, is the other side. So we've got lots of questioning where we weren't seeing in the older kids was like, okay, yeah, you saw this thing on Facebook that asked questions about this, but like, what is the weight of that evidence versus we just had you do research on the NIH website. What is the weight of that evidence, and how do you determine? So, I think I went a little bit on a tangent there, but I think the idea being that that's part of the difficulty, is not the asking questions, because we should be doing that, but also like, how do we determine what evidence is good evidence?
Sure. And I think one additional element of that would be likelihood. So when we're talking about population-based studies or whatever, or even the stroke, what is the likelihood that I'm going to have this adverse reaction? I use the example of black hairy tongue and amoxicillin. How often does that happen? It's very rare. The impact that it can have on your cell lines, that's real, it's true, but it's extremely uncommon. And so because of that very low likelihood, it takes that risk into a different category in your mind, because the risk is there, but it's small. Whereas the risk of, me staying up all night for the next 3 nights with my child screaming all night because they're in pain, like, that risk is very real and very present and highly likely. And so that skews your decision in that direction. And I think in all of those boxes of risk, you also have to assign a likelihood. And what's it, from our standpoint in the emergency department, how is this going to read in the newspaper tomorrow? When I was in training, that's one of my attendings would always ask, like, what's the headline going to be tomorrow based on the decision that you just made? And it's kind of that same concept of like, what risk are you exposing the patient to that has a very negative downside? So I think I think it's a fascinating conversation. And at the end of the day, the question is, what risk are you most comfortable taking on? Because there's risk on all sides of every medical decision, what's the risk you're most comfortable with?
I do think that part of it, and this is something that, we think a lot about in the elementary and secondary education, and I think people are thinking more about it as we are talking about the ability of scientists and health professionals to communicate with patients and communities, but really thinking about how do you characterize risk in a way that is that people can interpret cleanly, and then how do they weigh the risk for themselves personally? Anecdotally, I feel like it's a lot harder to imagine things that are distant, far off future things versus like the immediate, like, so you're talking about the kids screaming. It's like, they know that life because they're there right there.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like, oh, one day you may develop a thing, is a little bit harder to characterize. So on the education side, definitely trying to help people interpret this information and get them to the point where they can say, okay, this is what this makes this a little bit more concrete for me. This is what this means. And this is how I can assess the risk for myself. And then on the communication side, for both us in the education space, but also for people who are out practicing, making sure that the communication supports that for people who are there. So they can, be their own version of thinking like scientists, right? They can
absolutely. 100%. And that's probably a good takeaway is we can't just assume that because we have the scientific background, we may have the scientific knowledge. That does not necessarily convey authority. And so, presenting the information in a way that patients can make an informed decision is really important. I think now more so than ever. And so it's incumbent upon us to give patients the information they need to make their own bad decisions. I tell my teenagers all the time, you're old enough to make your own bad decisions. This is a bad decision. Knock yourself out, kid.
I think, not to add an extra level of wrinkle to this, but also given that we are in a setting where there are so many, you mentioned Dr. Google at the beginning, there's so many resources out there for people to use. And I think it's not just saying like, hey, make your own bad decisions, but also like, as you're looking through resources, these are the things that I would ask before I took this information over that information. Like, is ChatGPT going to be the thing that you depend on, or are you going to look at other sources? Like, what are the resources that you can use to decide on your own personal bad decision? I think that's kind of where also our future is going, because it's kind of already here.
Oh, you're right. There's research out there. Maybe we'll do an episode on the number of people that use ChatGPT or some AI before presenting to the doctor. Higher than you would expect. We'll get into that at another time. So to wrap this up, the thing that I wish I knew, this is a podcast about things I'd like to know and things I wish I knew back then. I wish I knew earlier in my career how to have these conversations and how important it was to build trust with patients through the transparency of presenting them information that I'm using to make my recommendations. I think that goes a long way in building rapport and earning trust with patients. And like I said, we'll delve into that a little deeper maybe next time. For now, that'll be it for us today. Thank you, Dr. Newell, for joining us. I hope we can have you on the show again. I hope it wasn't too painful an experience for you. We're delighted to have you.
It's been fantastic. Thank you for having me.
All right. We're always happy to have you be part of the conversation. If you want to reach out to us, you can reach us at shiftchangepod@gmail.com. Tell us what you'd like to hear about. Give us your feedback on our shows and your opinions. We'd love to hear them. And until next time, be safe and make good decisions. Only a doctor would say, I'm just a doctor.
We have to change the narrative.
I need to rekindle this curiosity about why we do what we do.
Give yourself time to mourn the change of the shift that you're in your life.
It's okay when it feels like too much.
It's okay.